In this and in the following demo, we are going to work on our checkout page. The checkout page is mainly going to be a form where the user can enter his or her personal data and also some information about the order. At this point, the checkout page is pretty empty. Let's change that. Since I want to capture information about the user has to be able to fill in some form fields. And all these form fields are going to be part of a form. So that's the first thing I'm going to be adding here. So here is my form. I give it an ID of main form, and the method is going to be post. It's going to be posting the data to our server. Inside of the form, I'm going to start by adding a field set, and I'm also giving it a class, and I'm also specifying the legend, which is the text which will be appearing at the top of the form. All of my form fields will be inside of this div here. Quite logically, one of the first things I want to capture is the first name and the last name of the user. For this, I'm using some old school input type is text, so plain text inputs. At this point, there's really nothing special with these two inputs going on. The next thing I want to capture is the email. For this, I'm going to use a new input type is email. Automatically, as we'll see when we run this demo, my browser will validate that the entered data is indeed a valid email address. Next, I'm going to be adding some more input type equal texts. At this point, as said, they're simple text inputs, but we'll come back to them in the next demo. So I have added an input for the street, for the number, for the zip code, for the city, for the country, and for the phone number. Users can also enter their URL, for example, for their blog. For that, I'm using the new input type equals URL. Again, the browser will validate that the entered value is indeed a valid URL. Finally, I'm also adding again a plain input type equals text to enter a remark. Inside of my form, I can add multiple field sets, and I'm going to do that next. I'm going to add another field set to capture information about the order itself. Here's my second field set that has a legend, your order. And in there, I'm going to add some more input types. First, I'm going to query the user for his or her birth date. This is typically something that I want to capture as a date, so I use the new input type equals date. Also, Joe's Coffee Store offers the option to wrap items as gifts, and they allow the user to pick the color of the paper. Now, asking a user to enter a color value is very hard. That is why we are going to use the new input type is color to capture the color information. And the people at Joe's Coffee Store are quite festive. They also allow people to put a couple of bows on their gift. Now this is a number, and that is why we use the input type is number to make sure that the entered value is indeed a number. Finally, to submit the form, we need to enter an input type equals submit. And we're ready with the form. Let's run it now. Here we are now on the resulting page, and let's test those new input types. I'm going to enter a value for the first name, for the last name, and I'm going to enter an invalid email address. I'm going to try submitting this now. Place order, and as you can see, the browser will flag an error. Another thing to notice is the browser support as mentioned for the input types. The requested delivery date was an input type equals date, and as you can see, Internet Explorer doesn't give us any UI to make entering a date easier. And the same goes for the wrapping paper colors, so that input type equals color. Now let's jump to Chrome. And as you can see, Chrome is effectively showing us a date picker. Also, for the input type is color, it has some UI. Chrome also has better support for this input type numeric. It shows this numeric up-down buttons, as you can see working here. Now, our form is not yet complete. For example, the country, I can enter whatever value I want in there. There are some other things that we need to add. Let's go back to the slides, and in the next demo, we'll improve on this checkout form. We have now seen that HTML5 has added quite a few new input types which try to guide the user to enter data from the very first time. Now HTML5 does go further and adds more features to form data validation. There are new attributes which have been added which we can use to validate that data was entered where it's required or in the correct format. This basically extends what the new input types are doing. Also, there are some new validations possible on the form level itself. Let's take a look. We'll start by looking at the new attributes which were added to HTML5, and the first one we'll consider is the max length attribute. The max length is pretty easy to understand. When we add this onto an input, the input length will be limited to the max length value. Now in the sample code here, we see that the input's max length is set to 20. When the user tries to enter the 21st character, this won't be possible as this is prohibited by using that attribute. The pattern attribute is also an interesting one. It allows us to specify a regex, a regular expression, which will be applied on the entered data. Only when there's a match with the pattern, the input is considered correct. Since this is extensible, we can use just any regex we want. This one is pretty useful. If you want to validate a phone number, a social security number, and so on, this one is your friend. At the bottom of the page on the screenshot here, we see that when there's no match, the browser will notify the user of this. HTML5 also comes with the required attribute. This attribute, unlike the pattern attribute for example, requires no value. We just add it onto the input. When this attribute is added, you specify that the form shouldn't be possible to submit without the user having entered a value for this input. Now when the user does try to click on the submit button to submit the form basically, the empty required fields will be marked, again dependent on the browser. And you can see that here in the screenshots on the slide. We've already discussed the range input type. You'll probably remember that this input was rendered as a slider. Now such a slider brings with it that picking a specific value is rather difficult. If you want to have numeric input between a minimum and a maximum, you can use the min and max attributes, which you remember again from the range input. However, here we are adding these attributes on numeric input. In this case, the browser will render this as a regular input, but will flag an error when the specified value is not between the minimum and the maximum values. A good user experience here does require that you specify these values somewhere on the form, instead of letting the user guess, of course. The placeholder attribute can be used to specify a value or text, which will be displayed inside of the input when the user hasn't entered a value yet. This is useful to give a hint on the expected input. For example, we can use these to specify that we are expecting the user's first name and last name in the form, as you can see here in the code and in the screenshot. Now by default, a form will validate that the entered values in the inputs are in the correct format, and that, for example, required fields did receive a value. Only after that has taken place, the form can be submitted. However, there is a no validate attribute on the form. And when specifying this value, you are saying to the form that it can submit without firing validations on the fields. Now you may ask, why is this useful? One good reason to do so is that you'll do all of your validation on the server side, which you should do in any case, by the way. In this case, you can then use the input guides, such as date and color, to make sure that the user enters as much information as possible in a correct form. But if something goes wrong, you do want the user to be able to submit, and you as developer then agree to handle everything on the server side. Next to having the noValidate on the form level, we also have the form noValidate. The noValidate is a form attribute. The form noValidate is an input level attribute. We can use this attribute on the input type submit, which will allow to submit the form without validations on the client triggering. Let us now return to the checkout page. We'll extend it with the newly learned validation features of HTML5.